"You're so boring, Jeffrey. Honestly, I don't know why I even bother with you anymore." Rose's words echoed through the crowded university cafeteria as she stood up from our table, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech that made everyone turn to look. She didn't lower her voice. She wanted them to hear. She wanted everyone to witness my humiliation. Arthur, her new boyfriend, smirked from across the room where he sat with his wealthy fraternity brothers. His designer watch caught the fluorescent light as he raised his hand in a mocking wave. The same Arthur who used to copy my homework, who begged me for tutoring help just months ago. Now he was the golden boy with his father's trust fund and his flashy convertible parked outside. "I mean, what do you even do for fun?" Rose continued, her voice getting louder, more theatrical. "Study? Read books? God, you're like an old man trapped in a 22-year-old's body." Laughter rippled through the nearby tables. Phones came out, cameras pointed in my direction. I could already imagine the social media posts, the memes they'd make of my stunned expression. Alicia, Rose's best friend, nodded enthusiastically from beside her. "I told you, Rose, you deserve someone exciting, someone with ambition, someone who can actually afford to take you somewhere nice." Her eyes swept over my thrift store clothes, my worn sneakers, my backpack held together with duct tape. I sat there frozen, my half-eaten sandwich forgotten on the plastic tray. 2 years. 2 years I'd been with Rose, thinking we were building something real. 2 years of walking her to class, listening to her dreams, supporting her through every exam and every family drama. 2 years of believing that love was enough, that my quiet devotion meant something. "I'm sorry, Jeffrey," Rose said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But I can't pretend anymore. You're boring, and I need more than that." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the linoleum. Arthur stood up to meet her halfway, wrapping his arm around her waist as they left together. The cafeteria slowly returned to normal, but I could feel the stares, hear the whispers, the boring guy who got dumped, the nobody who thought he could keep a girl like Rose. I picked up my tray with trembling hands and walked to the trash bin, throwing away not just my lunch, but apparently everything I thought I knew about myself. My name is Jeffrey Collins, and until that day in the cafeteria, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the quiet one, the reliable one, the guy who always had his homework done, and never caused any trouble. I worked 2 part-time jobs to pay for my education while living in the cheapest dorm room on campus. My clothes came from thrift stores, my textbooks were always used, and my idea of a fancy dinner was the Chinese takeout place that offered student discounts. I met Rose during our sophomore year in Professor Martinez's literature class. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, confident, effortlessly beautiful. Her blonde hair always seemed to catch the light perfectly, and when she smiled, it was like watching the sun break through clouds. She came from money, the kind of family that had country club memberships and vacation homes. Her father owned a chain of successful restaurants, and her mother was involved in every charity organization in the city. But despite our differences, something clicked between us. Rose said she loved how I actually listened when she talked, how I remembered the little things she mentioned. While other guys tried to impress her with expensive gifts and flashy gestures, I offered her something different: genuine attention, thoughtful conversations, and a sense of stability she claimed she'd never had before. "You're so different from everyone else, Jeffrey," she used to tell me during those late-night study sessions in the library. "You're real. You care about things that actually matter." We'd sit there surrounded by towers of books, sharing vending machine snacks and talking about everything from philosophy to our dreams for the future. Those were the moments I treasured most, when it felt like the world had shrunk down to just the two of us. Our relationship wasn't conventional by any means. While her friends went to expensive restaurants and exclusive clubs, Rose and I had our own traditions. Picnics in the park with sandwiches I'd packed, free concerts at the student center, long walks through the city where we'd window shop and dream about the future. She seemed to enjoy the simplicity of it all, often saying it was refreshing to be with someone who wasn't trying to buy her affection. Arthur Morrison was everything I wasn't, and perhaps that's what made him so appealing to Rose in the end. He was the president of the most prestigious fraternity on campus, drove a red Ferrari his father had bought him for his 21st birthday, and wore suits that cost more than I made in 3 months. His father owned Morrison Industries, a multinational corporation that had made the family incredibly wealthy. Arthur had never worked a day in his life, never worried about money, never had to choose between buying textbooks or eating dinner. But here's what people didn't know about Arthur. He was failing most of his classes. Despite having access to the best tutors money could buy, he simply didn't care about his education. He knew that regardless of his grades, he'd graduate with a business degree and walk into a cushy executive position at his father's company. The only reason he bothered showing up to class at all was to maintain his social status and meet girls. Alicia Chen had been Rose's best friend since high school, and she'd never particularly liked me. She came from old money, the kind of family whose wealth went back generations. Her great-grandfather had built a shipping empire, and her family's influence extended into politics and high society. Alicia attended university more as a social activity than for education, treating it like an extended networking opportunity. She was the one who introduced Rose to Arthur at a fraternity party I hadn't been invited to. "Rose deserves better," Alicia would say whenever she thought I wasn't listening. "She's settling for someone beneath her station. It's embarrassing." She never said it directly to my face, but her disapproval was obvious in every interaction. She'd roll her eyes when I joined their conversations, make subtle comments about my appearance or my lack of expensive possessions, and consistently push Rose toward wealthier, more socially connected guys. What hurt the most wasn't just Rose's betrayal, but how quickly everything unraveled once she'd made her decision. Friends who had once included me in their plans suddenly became unavailable. Study groups I'd participated in for months no longer had space for me. Even professors seemed to look at me differently, as if my academic performance somehow reflected my personal failures. The whispers followed me everywhere. "Did you hear what Rose said about Jeffrey? I always thought he was kind of weird. She's so much better off with Arthur." It was like watching my entire identity crumble in real time. Everything I'd thought was solid about my life, my relationship, my friendships, my sense of self-worth, turned out to be built on foundations that could be destroyed with a few cruel words in a public setting. But what bothered me most was the way Rose looked at me in those final moments, like I was something pitiable, something to be discarded. There was no warmth in her eyes, no recognition of the 2 years we'd spent together, no acknowledgement of the person who had listened to her fears at 3 in the morning or celebrated her successes as if they were my own. I had become, in her words, boring. And apparently, that was the worst thing a person could be. The night after the cafeteria incident, I sat in my dorm room staring at the photos on my desk, images of Rose and me at various campus events, smiling and happy. In every picture, I looked genuinely content, like I'd found exactly where I belonged. Now those same photos felt like evidence of my own delusion. Had she been pretending the entire time? Had she always seen me as a placeholder until something better came along? I began to understand that my biggest mistake hadn't been loving Rose, but believing that being a good person was enough. In a world where success was measured by bank accounts and social status, my kindness and reliability were worthless. I was boring because I couldn't afford excitement. I was forgettable because I didn't have the resources to make myself memorable. That realization changed everything. The real pain started the next morning when I realized Rose's words had become campus-wide entertainment. Social media posts tagged me in memes about boring boyfriends, and everywhere I went, people seemed to be talking about the spectacle they'd witnessed. But the humiliation was just the beginning of a much larger problem that would force me to make a decision that would change everything forever. The morning after Rose's public humiliation, I woke up to 17 missed calls from my mother and 43 text messages I couldn't bear to read. Someone had recorded the entire cafeteria scene and posted it online with the caption, "When keeping it real goes boring." The video had been shared hundreds of times across different platforms, turning my personal heartbreak into viral entertainment. I dragged myself to my morning economics class, hoping to find some normalcy in routine. Professor Davidson was discussing market volatility when Arthur walked in 20 minutes late, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the floor. He chose the seat directly behind me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Hey, boring boy," he whispered, just loud enough for the students around us to hear. "How's life without a girlfriend?" Snickers rippled through the nearby seats. I kept my eyes fixed on my notebook, pretending to take notes while my hands shook with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. After class, Arthur cornered me outside the building. "Look, Jeffrey, no hard feelings, right? Rose just upgraded, you understand?" He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo from the night before, Rose sitting in his Ferrari, laughing at something off camera. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something elegant and expensive. Took her to that new French place downtown, the one where dinner costs more than you make in a week. I wanted to punch him. I wanted to scream about how he'd stolen my girlfriend with daddy's money, how none of this was fair. Instead, I walked away, because that's what boring people do. They take the abuse and pretend it doesn't hurt. But the worst was yet to come. During lunch, I overheard a conversation at the table behind me that made my blood run cold. Alec. Ia was talking to a group of sorority girls, her voice carrying clearly across the dining hall. The funniest part is that Jeffrey actually thought he had a chance with Rose long term, she was saying. Like seriously? A scholarship kid from the wrong side of town thinking he could marry into our social circle? It was cute in a pathetic way. One of the other girls giggled. Didn't Rose say he was planning to propose after graduation? Oh my God, yes! Alicia's laughter was sharp and cruel. He'd been saving up for months to buy some tiny ring from a discount jewelry store. Rose showed me the store website he'd bookmarked on his laptop. It was hilarious. The ring cost less than my monthly manicure budget. My appetite disappeared completely. They were right, I had been saving. Every spare dollar from my part-time jobs at the campus bookstore and the local coffee shop had gone into a small savings account. I'd been planning to propose after graduation, had even spoken to Rose's father about my intentions during their last family visit. He'd been polite but distant, probably already knowing what his daughter really thought of me. Arthur's ring budget is probably bigger than Jeffrey's entire college fund, another girl added, and they all dissolved into laughter. I left the dining hall and walked aimlessly around campus, ending up at the small garden behind the library where Rose and I used to study together. It was there that I realized the true scope of my humiliation. This wasn't just about losing a girlfriend, it was about being exposed as someone who had fundamentally misunderstood his place in the world. That evening, my roommate Mike tried to cheer me up. Dude, forget her, Rose was always kind of shallow anyway, you're better off without her. But even Mike's support felt hollow. He was being kind, but I could see the pity in his eyes. Everyone could see what I'd been blind to. I was the charity case who'd gotten ideas above his station. The breaking point came 3 days later during my shift at the campus coffee shop. Rose walked in with Arthur and Alicia, all three of them laughing about something. They didn't notice me behind the counter at first, too caught up in their conversation. The wedding will be at the country club, obviously, Alicia was saying. Daddy's already spoken to the event coordinator about availability next summer. Rose beamed. Arthur proposed last night. Look. She held up her hand, displaying a diamond ring that caught the light and threw rainbows across the wall. It was enormous, probably worth more than everything I owned combined. Arthur spotted me behind the espresso machine and smirked. 3 lattes, Jeffrey, make them good, we're celebrating. He emphasized my name mockingly, drawing out each syllable. My hands trembled as I prepared their drinks. Rose was engaged. Less than a week after dumping me for being boring, she was engaged to Arthur. As I handed over their order, she finally looked at me directly for the first time since the cafeteria incident. Oh, Jeffrey, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I heard you've been having a hard time. Maybe this is a good learning experience for you. You know, about managing expectations and being realistic about what you can achieve. Thanks for the advice, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. As they left, I heard Arthur telling Rose, you should probably block him on social media. Guys like that sometimes get weird and obsessive after rejected. On. That night, I sat in my dorm room staring at my laptop screen. My savings account showed a balance of $3,247, the money I'd been setting aside for Rose's engagement ring. It wasn't much, but it represented months of sacrifice, of choosing ramen noodles over real meals, of walking to work instead of taking the bus. I thought about my life trajectory: graduate with decent grades, find an entry-level job, work my way up slowly while living paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, Arthur would inherit a business empire, and Rose would live in luxury she'd never had to earn. They'd tell stories at dinner parties about the boring guy who thought he was good enough for her, and everyone would laugh. For the first time in my life, I understood that being a good person wasn't enough. Kindness didn't pay rent, reliability didn't impress anyone. Loyalty was worthless if you couldn't back it up with a bank account. I had been playing by rules that no longer applied, fighting a battle with weapons that were obsolete. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began researching something I'd never seriously considered before: dropping out of university. Not to give up, but to start over completely. If Rose thought I was boring because I was poor, then I'd show her exactly how interesting money could make a person. The hardest part wasn't making the decision to disappear, it was living with the consequences of that choice during those first few months. I withdrew from university at the end of the semester, telling my parents I needed a break to figure things out. The disappointment in my mother's voice when I called her still haunts me. She'd worked double shifts at the hospital for years to help pay for my education, and I was throwing it away for what seemed like wounded pride. "Jeffrey, honey, I know you're hurt about Rose," she said, her voice cracking through the phone. "But don't let one girl ruin your entire future. You're so close to graduating." I couldn't explain to her that this wasn't about Rose anymore. It was about everything Rose represented, everything I'd been denied because of circumstances beyond my control. I used my savings to rent a tiny studio apartment in the warehouse district, far from campus and anyone who might recognize me. The place was barely habitable: water stains on the ceiling, a radiator that clanged all night, neighbors who played music until dawn. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was where I could disappear completely from my old life. The loneliness was crushing. I'd gone from having a girlfriend, friends, and a clear path forward to having absolutely nothing. My phone stopped ringing after the first few weeks. Mike, my former roommate, sent a few texts asking where I'd gone, but eventually even he stopped trying. It was like I'd been erased from existence, which was exactly what I'd wanted, but somehow more painful than I'd anticipated. I spent my days researching, learning, planning. I read everything I could about successful entrepreneurs who'd started from nothing. I studied market trends, investment strategies, emerging technologies. The public library became my office, and I claimed the same corner table every day from opening until closing. The librarian started to recognize me, this strange young man who checked out business books by the dozen and took notes in worn composition notebooks. The self-doubt was relentless. What made me think I could succeed where so many others had failed? I had no business experience, no connections, no capital beyond my small savings. Every night, I'd lie on my mattress on the floor and wonder if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe Rose was right. Maybe I was boring, unremarkable, destined for mediocrity. But then I'd remember Arthur's smirk, Alicia's cruel laughter, the way Rose had looked at me like I was something to be pitied. The memory of that humiliation would burn away the doubt and replace it with determination. I wasn't doing this to win Rose back. She was gone, and I was beginning to understand that losing her might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. I was doing this to prove that their definition of worth was wrong, that a person's value couldn't be measured solely by their bank account or family connections. The breakthrough came 6 months after I'd disappeared. I was researching cryptocurrency trends when I noticed something interesting, a pattern in how certain types of online content were performing. Social media influencers were making fortunes by creating digital products, but they were all targeting the same demographics. There was a massive underserved market that everyone was ignoring. I started small, creating simple digital tools and courses targeted at demographics that bigger companies overlooked. My first product was a budgeting app designed specifically for college students like my former self, people who needed to track every dollar but couldn't afford expensive financial software. I built it using free programming tutorials and tested it in online forums where struggling students gathered. The app gained traction slowly at first, then explosively. Within 3 months, I had over 10,000 users. I started charging a small monthly fee, just enough to cover my basic expenses and reinvest in improvements. The money wasn't significant yet, but it was mine, earned through my own efforts, not inherited or handed to me. During this time, I deliberately avoided all social media and contact with anyone from my past. I didn't want to know what Rose and Arthur were doing, didn't want to see wedding planning photos or engagement announcements. The temptation to check was constant, especially during the long, lonely nights in my studio apartment. But I knew that looking backward would only weaken my resolve. My parents worried constantly. They'd drive by my apartment building sometimes, and I'd see my father's car parked across the street. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd become a hermit because of heartbreak. They weren't entirely wrong, but they couldn't understand that I was rebuilding myself from the ground up, not falling apart. The physical transformation was gradual but noticeable. The stress of my old life had kept me thin and anxious. Now, with a clear purpose and growing confidence, I started taking better care of myself. I joined a cheap gym, bought better clothes when I could afford them, even got a decent haircut. More importantly, I carried myself differently. The slouching, apologetic posture of someone who expected to be overlooked was replaced by the straight-backed confidence of someone with a plan. By the end of my first year away, my app had generated enough revenue to fund 2 additional projects. I was still living in the same crappy apartment, still eating cheap meals, but now it was by choice rather than necessity. Every dollar I didn't spend on luxury was reinvested in my growing business. I was learning to think like an entrepreneur, to see opportunities where others saw problems. The isolation that had initially felt like punishment began to feel like protection. Away from the judgments and expectations of my former social circle, I could experiment, fail, and try again without anyone watching. I was becoming someone new, someone I wouldn't have been able to become if I'd stayed in my comfortable, predictable life with Rose. But late at night, when the city was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I sometimes wondered if I was fooling myself. Was I really building something meaningful, or was I just an angry young man trying to prove a point that no one would ever care about? Just when I thought I understood the game I was playing, a chance encounter would reveal that everything I thought I knew about my past was wrong, and the people I'd been trying to prove wrong had secrets of their own that would change everything. 18 months after my disappearance, I was having lunch at a small diner downtown when I overheard a conversation that shattered everything I thought I knew about my past. I was sitting in a back booth, reviewing quarterly reports for my expanding business portfolio, when 2 middle-aged men sat down behind me, their voices carried clearly in the nearly empty restaurant. "Morrison Industries is hemorrhaging money," one of them was saying. "Arthur's father has been covering it up for years, but the quarterly reports don't lie. They're maybe 6 months away from bankruptcy." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Morrison Industries, Arthur's family business. "The kid doesn't know, does he?" the second man asked. "Arthur still thinks he's inheriting an empire." "Are you kidding? Robert Morrison would rather die than admit to his son that the company is failing. He's been propping up the stock price with borrowed money and creative accounting. When it all comes out, the scandal will be massive." I set down my fork and listened more intently, pretending to read my documents while absorbing every word. "What about the engagement? Didn't Arthur just marry that restaurant owner's daughter? Rose Liu? Yeah, that wedding was 3 months ago. Biggest society event of the year, according to my wife. But here's the interesting part. Robert Morrison specifically chose that girl because her father's restaurant chain is one of the few profitable ventures left in their investment portfolio. The marriage was essentially a business merger disguised as romance. My blood ran cold. Rose had married Arthur 3 months ago, but more importantly, it sounded like their entire relationship had been orchestrated by Arthur's father for financial reasons. So the girl doesn't know she married into a failing business. Neither of them knows. Robert's been juggling creditors and falsifying reports to keep up appearances. But I've seen the real numbers. They'll be lucky if they can keep the lights on through the end of the year. After the men left, I sat there stunned, processing this information. Everything I'd believed about Arthur's superiority, about Rose choosing wealth over love, had been built on an illusion. Arthur wasn't the successful heir apparent I'd thought he was. He was just another pawn in his father's desperate financial schemes. That evening, I did something I'd avoided for 18 months. I looked up Rose and Arthur on social media. Their wedding photos showed exactly what the man in the diner had described, the biggest society event of the year. Rose looked radiant in a designer gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. Arthur stood beside her in a custom tuxedo, every inch the successful young businessman. But now I saw the photos differently. Rose's smile seemed forced in some shots, and Arthur's eyes held a tension I recognized from my own mirror during those final months at university. They looked like people playing roles rather than celebrating genuine happiness. I dug deeper into public records and financial filings. My business success had taught me how to read between the lines of corporate documents, and what I found was damning. Morrison Industries had been in decline for years, propped up by increasingly desperate measures. Robert Morrison had mortgaged everything, the family estate, Arthur's trust fund, even Rose's father's restaurant chain, to keep up appearances. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Rose hadn't left me for a better life, she'd left me for what she thought was a better life, only to end up trapped in an elaborate financial house of cards. While I'd been building a real business from nothing, she'd married into debt disguised as wealth. But the twist that really changed everything came when I discovered Arthur's college transcripts through a contact I'd made in the business world. Not only had Arthur been failing most of his classes, as I'd suspected, but he'd been paying other students to write his papers and take his exams. One of those students had been keeping records, including correspondence that painted a very different picture of Arthur than the confident playboy I remembered. The emails revealed Arthur's crippling anxiety about living up to his father's expectations, his awareness that he was intellectually outmatched by his peers, and most shocking of all, his genuine fear that Rose was too good for him. In one message to his paid academic proxy, Arthur had written, "I don't understand what Rose sees in me. I'm not smart like that Jeffrey guy she used to date. At least he could actually help her with her studies instead of just throwing money at problems." Arthur Morrison, the man who had humiliated me and stolen my girlfriend, had spent their entire relationship feeling inferior to me. The irony was staggering. I spent the next few days researching more, and the picture that emerged was of two families, the Morrisons and the Lius, locked in a financial death spiral disguised as social success. Rose's father's restaurant chain was failing too, which explained why he'd been so eager to marry his daughter into what he thought was the Morrison fortune. Both families were essentially broke, sustaining themselves on credit and the illusion of wealth. Meanwhile, my own business had grown beyond my wildest expectations. The budgeting app had led to a suite of financial tools, which had led to consulting contracts, which had led to investment opportunities. I was now worth more than Arthur's family had ever been, even in their heyday. The boring scholarship kid that Rose had publicly humiliated, Ed was now wealthier than the people she'd left him for. But wealth hadn't made me feel the way I'd expected. The satisfaction of success was real, but it was hollow compared to what I'd thought it would be. I realized that I'd spent 18 months building a fortune to impress people who weren't worth impressing, trying to prove myself to individuals whose opinions shouldn't have mattered. The real twist wasn't that Arthur was broke or that Rose had married into debt, it was that I no longer cared about either of them. The person I'd become during my disappearance was stronger, more confident, and more genuinely successful than I'd ever imagined possible. I didn't need their validation or their regret. I'd already won by becoming someone I was proud to be. But life had one more surprise in store. A week after these revelations, I received an unexpected visitor at my office, a real office now, in a gleaming downtown building with my name on the door. My assistant buzzed me on the intercom. "Mr. Collins, there's a woman here to see you. She says her name is Rose Morrison, and it's urgent." Rose. She'd found me somehow, tracked down the man she'd once called boring and unremarkable. After 2 years of silence, she was standing in my lobby, asking to see me. The question was, what did she want, and more importantly, what did I want to say to her? The moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since that day in the cafeteria had finally arrived, but now that Rose was here, I realized that the confrontation I'd imagined so many times might not unfold the way I'd expected. 2 years of growth had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I told my assistant to wait 5 minutes, then send Rose in. Those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. I stood at my office window, looking down at the city below, trying to reconcile the image of the woman who had destroyed my self-esteem with the desperate person who was now seeking me out. The view from the 40th floor was spectacular, a constant reminder of how far I'd climbed from that cramped studio apartment in the warehouse district. When Rose walked through my office door, I barely recognized her. The confident, glowing woman from the wedding photos had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely desperate. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. "Jeffrey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, studying her as she sat down. She looked around my office, taking in the awards on the walls, the expensive furniture, the subtle displays of wealth that marked this space as belonging to someone who had made it in the world. "Nice office," she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I read about your success in Forbes. 30 under 30 entrepreneurs to watch." That's amazing, Jeffrey." It's interesting how success changes people's perspectives, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. 2 years ago, you told a room full of people that I was boring and would never amount to anything. Now you're sitting in my office, impressed by my achievements. What changed, Rose? She flinched at the directness of my question. I was young and stupid. I said things I didn't mean because I was confused about what I wanted. Were you confused, or were you just honest? I leaned back in my chair. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you got exactly what you said you wanted. Arthur, the excitement, the glamorous life. You're married to him now, aren't you? Rose's facade cracked, and tears began to stream down her cheeks. It's all falling apart, Jeffrey. Everything is falling apart, and I don't know what to do. I waited, letting her compose herself. Part of me, a very small part, felt sorry for her. But a larger part remembered the laughter in that cafeteria, the humiliation that had nearly broken me. Arthur's family is bankrupt, she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. His father has been lying to everyone for years. The business is gone, the house is being foreclosed on, and apparently, my father's restaurants are going to be seized by creditors. Everything we thought we had was built on lies and debt. I know, I said simply. Rose looked up sharply. You know? I've known for weeks. When you have the kind of resources I have now, it's not difficult to research someone's financial situation. Morrison Industries has been insolvent for 3 years. Your father's business isn't much better. The wedding you had was essentially funded by credit cards and loans against assets that were already mortgaged. The color drained from Rose's face. Then you know that Arthur and we're basically homeless. His father disappeared last week when the FBI started investigating the company's books. Arthur's been having panic attacks, and I don't know how to help him. And you came to me because? Rose took a shaky breath. Because you're the only person I know who understands what it's like to have nothing and still figure out how to survive. Because you're successful now, and maybe you could help us. I stood up and walked to the window again, my back to her. Let me understand this correctly. You publicly humiliated me, married their man for his money, and now that the money is gone, you want me to rescue you. It wasn't like that, Rose protested. I didn't marry Arthur for money, I married him because I thought I loved him. Did you? I turned to face her. Or did you love the lifestyle he represented, the expensive dinners, the country club membership, the social status that came with being a Morrison? Rose was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. I don't know anymore. I thought I did, but now I realize I never really knew Arthur at all. He's not the confident, successful man I thought he was. He's scared and weak, and when everything started falling apart, he just gave up. Unlike boring old Jeffrey, who actually built something real when his world fell apart. Don't, she whispered. Please don't throw that back at me. I know what I said was cruel and unfair. I've regretted it every day since. Have you? I sat back down, leaning forward across the desk. Because according to your social media posts, you've been living your best life for the past 2 years. Fancy vacations, expensive restaurants, designer clothes. When exactly did the regret kick in? When the credit cards got maxed out? Rose buried her face in her hands. You have every right to hate me. I destroyed what we had because I was shallow and materialistic and stupid. But Jeffrey, the person I was then, that's not who I am now. Isn't it? Because it seems to me like you're still the same person, just in different circumstances. When you had money, you looked down on me. Now that you need help, you're here acting like we were star-crossed lovers torn apart by fate instead of a woman who chose status over love. That's not fair, Rose said, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I made a mistake, a huge, terrible mistake, but I'm trying to make it right. By asking me for money, by asking for forgiveness, by trying to explain, in that I never stopped caring about you, even when I was too proud and too scared to admit it. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Rose, you didn't care about me when we were together. You cared about having a reliable, devoted boyfriend who made you feel special. But the moment someone with more money and status showed interest, you dropped me without a second thought. I was 22 years old and terrified of being ordinary, she said desperately. My parents had always told me I deserved the best, that I should never settle. When Arthur came along with his fancy car and his expensive gifts, it felt like proof that I was special, that I was worth more than a boring scholarship student who worked 2 jobs and shopped at thrift stores. Yes, she whispered, and I hate myself for thinking that way. I hate that I was so shallow and materialistic, But losing you made me realize that none of that stuff matters if you don't have someone who actually loves you. Arthur doesn't love you? Rose was quiet for a moment. Arthur loves the idea of me. He loves having a beautiful wife to show off at parties, but he doesn't know me, not really. He doesn't remember my favorite books or notice when I'm upset about something. He doesn't listen when I talk about my dreams or my fears. He just wants me to be pretty and agreeable and make him look good. So you want to come back to someone who actually paid attention to you, who actually cared about your thoughts and feelings? I want a chance to prove that I learned from my mistakes, Rose said. I want to show you that I can be the kind of person who deserves your love. I stood up again and walked over to a framed photo on my bookshelf, a picture of me at a charity gala I'd hosted the previous month. In the photo, I was standing with a group of scholarship recipients I'd funded, all of them young people from backgrounds similar to my own. Do you see this photo, Rose? She nodded. These are kids who remind me of who I used to be, smart, hard-working, but disadvantaged by circumstances beyond their control. Last year, I established a foundation that provides full scholarships to students like them. Do you know why? Because you remember what it was like to struggle? Because I learned that success means nothing if you don't use it to lift up people who deserve better than what they were born into. These kids aren't boring or unremarkable, they're just poor, and they shouldn't be punished for that. Rose was crying again. Jeffrey, I understand what you're saying. I was wrong about everything. I judged you based on superficial things that didn't matter. But can't people change? Can't someone learn from their mistakes and become better? I turned back to her. The question isn't whether people can change, Rose. The question is whether you've actually changed, or whether you're just saying what you think I want to hear because you need something from me. How can I prove it to you? You can't, I said simply. And that's the point. 2 years ago, you told everyone I was boring because I couldn't afford to take you to expensive restaurants or buy you designer clothes. You married another man because he had what you thought was money. Now that man is broke, and you're here asking me to save you. Even if I believed you changed, which I don't, this relationship would always be built on the foundation of you settling for me when your first choice didn't work out. Rose stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. Fine. You want to punish me forever for one stupid decision I made when I was barely an adult. You want to hold on to your anger and your resentment because it makes you feel powerful. I get it, but just remember that the person you're punishing isn't the same person who hurt you. You're right, I said, tears. Surprising her. You're not the same person, you're worse. The Rose who dumped me was young and shallow, but at least she was honest about what she wanted. The Rose standing in my office now is manipulative and calculating, trying to use our history and fake emotions to get what she needs. That's not true. Isn't it? If Arthur's family suddenly won the lottery tomorrow, would you still be here telling me about your mistakes and begging for forgiveness, or would you go back to your glamorous life and pretend this conversation never happened? Rose opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. We both knew the answer. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to walk out of my office and figure out your own problems. You're going to learn what it actually means to struggle and work for what you have instead of expecting other people to hand it to you. Maybe that will teach you the kind of lessons that will actually make you a better person. And if I can't, what if Arthur and I lose everything? Then you'll learn what I learned 2 years ago, that sometimes losing everything is the best thing that can happen to you. It forces you to discover who you really are underneath all the pretense and privilege. Rose gathered her purse and walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she turned back one last time. I did love you, you know. Maybe not the way I should have, but I did love you. No, I said quietly. You loved the way I made you feel about yourself. There's a difference. After she left, I sat alone in my office as the sun set over the city. I had won. Rose had come to me desperate and broken, looking for salvation I had the power to provide, but chose not to. It should have felt triumphant, but instead, it felt empty. The truth was, I had changed too. The angry, hurt young man who had disappeared 2 years ago would have gloated over Rose's downfall. But the person I'd become understood that revenge was a hollow victory. I didn't need Rose to suffer to validate my success. I'd already proven everything I needed to prove, to myself. What I discovered in the aftermath of Rose's visit was that true closure doesn't come from revenge or vindication, but from finally understanding that some chapters of your life are meant to stay closed. The final twist in my story wasn't about Rose at all, it was about learning who I had become and what I truly wanted for my future. 6 months after Rose's desperate visit to my office, I was standing in the reception hall of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, hosting the annual gala for my scholarship foundation. The event had grown beyond my wildest expectations. Over 500 attendees, including business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists, all gathered to support students who reminded me of my younger self. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same hotel where Rose and Arthur had held their wedding reception. But tonight, instead of celebrating empty social status, we were celebrating something that actually mattered: opportunity for those who deserved it, but couldn't afford it. "Jeffrey, there's someone here who'd like to meet you," my assistant said, approaching with a young woman in tow. "This is Sarah Chen, one of this year's scholarship recipients." Sarah was nervous but determined, reminding me instantly of myself at her age. "Mr. Collins, I wanted to thank you personally. Without this scholarship, I never would have been able to attend university. My family owns a small restaurant, and they work 16-hour days just to keep it running. This opportunity, it's everything." As I talked with Sarah and the other scholarship recipients throughout the evening, I realized something profound had shifted in my perspective. The success I'd built wasn't just about proving my worth to people who had underestimated me, it had become about creating opportunities for others who were facing the same barriers I'd once faced. Later that evening, as the gala was winding down, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the back of the room. Mike, my former college roommate, was talking to one of the foundation board members. When he saw me approaching, his face lit up with a genuine smile. "Jeffrey, man, I can't believe this is what you've been up to for the past 2 years. When you disappeared from campus, we all thought, well, we thought you'd had some kind of breakdown." "Maybe I did," I said, embracing my old friend. "But it turned out to be the kind of breakdown I needed." Mike looked around the elegant reception hall, taking in the well-dressed crowd and the obvious success of the event. "This is incredible. You've built an empire." "I've built something better than an empire," I corrected. "I've built something that matters." As Mike and I caught up, he filled me in on what had happened to our former classmates. Most were following predictable paths: corporate jobs, graduate school, early marriages. But then he brought up the subject I'd been avoiding. "Have you heard about Rose and Arthur?" he asked carefully. I nodded. "She came to see me a few months ago." "Then you know about the bankruptcy, the investigation, all of it?" "I know about all of it." Mike hesitated, then continued. "Well, there's been a development you might not know about. Arthur. He tried to commit suicide last month. He's in a psychiatric facility now, getting treatment. And Rose, she's moved back in with her parents and taken a job as a waitress at one of the chain restaurants that didn't get seized." The news hit me harder than I expected. Despite everything that had happened between us, I didn't wish genuine suffering on either of them. Arthur's mental health crisis spoke to pressures and expectations that I could understand, even if I'd chosen to respond to them differently. "How is Rose handling it?" "According to people who've seen her, she's different. Humbled, I guess. She's been working 60-hour weeks to help pay for Arthur's treatment and her family's legal fees. Some people say she's finally learning what real responsibility looks like." That night, after the gala ended and the last guests had departed, I sat in my penthouse apartment overlooking the city. The space was everything I'd dreamed of when I was living in that cramped studio: floor-to-ceiling windows, designer furniture, a kitchen that cost more than most people's cars. But what struck me most was how empty it felt despite all the luxury. I thought about Rose working as a waitress, probably wearing the same kind of uniform my mother had worn during her double shifts at the hospital. I thought about Arthur in a psychiatric facility, finally confronting the reality that money and status couldn't protect him from his own mental health struggles. Most of all, I thought about the person I'd become during my journey from that humiliated college student to successful entrepreneur. The revenge I'd fantasized about during those dark early months had materialized exactly as I'd imagined. Rose and Arthur had lost everything, while I'd gained everything. But the satisfaction I'd expected to feel was absent. Instead, I felt something I hadn't anticipated: compassion. The next morning, I made a decision that would have shocked my younger self. I called my lawyer and instructed him to set up an anonymous fund to help pay for Arthur's psychiatric treatment. Not because I forgave him for his cruelty, but because mental health shouldn't be a luxury available only to those who can afford it. I also arranged for Rose's family's restaurant to receive a small business loan through one of my investment companies, again anonymously. Not because I wanted her back, or because I thought she deserved special treatment, but because I'd learned that true success meant lifting others up rather than watching them fall. 3 months later, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from Rose, though she didn't know she was calling me. "Mr. Collins?" Her voice was different, more mature, less entitled. "This is Rose Morrison from Lou Family Restaurant. I'm calling to thank you for the business loan your company provided. I know it's unusual for a borrower to call the lender directly, but I wanted you to know how much this means to our family." I listened as she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about her plans for the restaurant, her commitment to paying back every penny of the loan, and her gratitude for the second chance. This wasn't the same woman who had begged me for help in my office. This was someone who had learned to work for what she needed. "There's one more thing," she said, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "I don't know if you'll understand this, but this loan has taught me something important about accepting help versus expecting it. Someone once told me that I needed to learn what it meant to struggle and work for what I have. I'm finally beginning to understand what they meant." After she hung up, I realized that my story wasn't really about revenge or vindication, it was about transformation. Both Rose and I had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, and both of us had emerged as different people. 2 years later, I was back at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel for another Foundation Gala. This time, the event was even larger, and we were announcing the opening of the Collins Center for Economic Opportunity, a training facility that would provide job skills and business development support to people transitioning out of poverty. As I was giving my keynote speech about second chances and the importance of judging people by their potential rather than their circumstances, I noticed a familiar face in the audience. Rose was sitting near the back, wearing a simple black dress and taking notes on everything I said. She looked healthy and confident, not the desperate woman who had pleaded with me in my office, but not the shallow socialite I'd once known either. After the speech, she approached me during the reception. "Hello, Jeffrey," she said, her voice steady and warm. "I hope you don't mind that I came tonight. I've been following your foundation's work, and I wanted to see you speak in person." "How are you, Rose?" "I'm good, really good, actually. The restaurant is thriving. We paid off the loan 6 months early. Arthur is doing much better too. He's in therapy and taking medication, and he started working as a counselor for other people struggling with anxiety and depression." "I'm glad to hear that." Rose smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, it seemed completely genuine. "I know this might sound strange, but I wanted to thank you for not helping me when I asked. You were right, I needed to learn how to solve my own problems. It was the best thing that ever happened to me." We talked for a few more minutes about her work, her family, and her plans for the future. There was no romantic tension, no hint of her wanting to rekindle our relationship. She had genuinely moved on, and so had I. As the evening ended and Rose prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Jeffrey, you were never boring. You were just real in a world full of people pretending to be something they weren't. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand the difference." After she left, I stood alone in the empty reception hall, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scared, hurt young man who had fled campus 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true success wasn't about proving others wrong, it was about becoming the kind of person who could help others prove themselves right.